Welcome. Today we are immersed in one of the darkest stories that happened within the walls of the city hospital. What if the scary legends you've heard about turn out to be true? We will tell you about events that cannot be explained, about the fear that paralyzes the will, that even experienced doctors and nurses prefer to hide in. Late one evening, Jennifer, a nurse with many years of experience, finished her night rounds at the city hospital. The evening was ordinary. Quiet rooms, rare calls from patients. The hospital, as always, was enveloped in an atmosphere of disturbing silence typical of such places. Jennifer worked in the department for seriously ill patients, many of whom were in critical condition. She knew that her shift could end in an unexpected tragedy, and she was mentally prepared for it. However, this time it was different. Midnight struck on the clock, and Jennifer, having finished her shift, decided to walk through the deserted corridors to make sure that everything was in order. Suddenly, in one of the farthest corners of the ward, she heard a soft, barely perceptible sound. It was coming from a room where no one was supposed to be. It was a quiet, but clearly human laugh. A nervous chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to go to the door. Looking inside, she saw an elderly patient. Mrs. Hendricks was lying in bed and chuckling softly. Jennifer felt relieved. It's okay. It's just that the woman may be dreaming or just remembered something pleasant. But when she entered the room and asked if everything was okay, Mrs. Hendricks looked at her with a completely blank stare. "Mrs. Hendricks, what's wrong?" Jennifer asked, trying to make contact. The woman did not answer. She just kept chuckling, but her gaze was blank and glassy. The laughter grew louder and louder, taking on a kind of nervous, insane tone. Jennifer felt that something was wrong and tried to call a doctor. However, the connection on her portable device suddenly disappeared, as if someone had disconnected it. The laughter became unbearably loud. It seemed to fill the whole room. Jennifer felt something squeeze her heart. She tried to calm Mrs. Hendricks down, but she suddenly stopped laughing and suddenly grabbed her arm. "Did you hear that?" the woman whispered, looking Jennifer straight in the eyes. "What did you hear?" the nurse asked, feeling her own heart begin to pound wildly. "It's here. It's laughing with us," whispered Mrs. Hendricks. At that moment, the door of the ward slowly opened and a doctor entered the room. He looked at Jennifer with a worried expression and said, "What's going on here?" Jennifer couldn't find the words. She just stood rooted to the spot, feeling that her hands were still being squeezed by Mrs. Hendricks' steely fingers. The doctor went to the bed and tried to free Jennifer, but as soon as he touched the old woman, she suddenly let go of the nurse and collapsed on the pillow, instantly falling into a deep sleep. Jennifer stepped back, trembling with horror. The doctor examined the patient carefully, and after making sure that her condition was stable, said, "It's just a reaction to medication. It's okay. She just reacted badly, the medication." But Jennifer knew that wasn't the case. It was something else, but she couldn't explain it. The doctor left, leaving her alone in the room with Mrs. Hendricks. The woman continued to laugh softly in her sleep. Her lips trembled, and her eyes remained closed. After the doctor left, Jennifer was left alone with an enduring sense of anxiety. Mrs. Hendricks' soft, barely audible laughter, which continued even in her sleep, penetrated her consciousness, making her think that something really scary was happening here. She was a nurse with many years of experience, had seen many difficult situations, but had never felt such chilling horror before. Several minutes passed, but Jennifer couldn't bring herself to leave the room. Her gaze was fixed on the old woman, who was giggling softly, then sighing deeply, as if she was dreaming of something painful. Jennifer decided to stay a little longer to make sure that Mrs. Hendricks was safe. She sat in a chair in the corner of the room and watched. It must have been about half an hour when the laughter suddenly stopped. The silence in the room became unbearably oppressive. Jennifer felt the tension in her body reaching its limit. Suddenly, she noticed that Mrs. Hendricks' breathing had become uneven and ragged. The old woman began to breathe heavily, as if suffocating. Jennifer jumped up from her chair and ran to the bed, trying to figure out what was going on. "Mrs. Hendricks, can you hear me?" Jennifer spoke loudly, trying to bring the patient back to consciousness. But the old woman only moaned softly and scratched the sheets with trembling hands. Her eyes, which had been closed recently, were now wide open, but still expressed nothing but deep horror. Jennifer tried to call for help, but her voice broke when she saw Mrs. Hendricks begin to slowly turn her head towards her. The old woman was looking directly at Jennifer. Her lips were moving, but the sound of the words was barely distinguishable. "It is here," she whispered. Before Jennifer could say anything, Mrs. Hendricks fell silent again. Her body began to twitch violently, as if it was being convulsed. Jennifer quickly took the old woman's hand and tried to stop her convulsions, but at that moment the door of the ward opened again, and 2 doctors ran in with a stretcher. One of them was the doctor who came earlier. "What happened?" he shouted, quickly assessing the situation. "She's suffocating," Jennifer said desperately, trying to keep Mrs. Hendricks on the bed. Doctors began to provide emergency care, but it was too late. Mrs. Hendricks fell silent. Her body went limp, and her eyes remained open, as if she were looking into the distance, not seeing anything around. Her face was frozen in an expression of deep horror, and her mouth was slightly open, as if in a last attempt to exhale what was tormenting her. It all happened so fast that Jennifer didn't immediately realize what had happened. Doctors tried to resuscitate the old woman, but without success. They pronounced her dead a few minutes later. One of them looked at Jennifer sympathetically, said nothing. She left the room, feeling her knees buckle and her head spin from what was happening. Everything inside her screamed with incomprehension and fear. Mrs. Hendricks died before her eyes, but there was something wrong with that death. She couldn't forget those last words that the old woman whispered to her. "It's here." For the next week, Jennifer tried to distract herself from what had happened by immersing herself in her work. She couldn't stop thinking about that night. She began to notice that other patients in the department were also starting to behave strangely. Some of them were bothered by the same strange laughter she had heard from Mrs. Hendricks. Others talked about feeling someone's presence in the room. But the most terrible thing began when one of the patients, a young man with severe pneumonia, began to tell that he felt like someone was sitting on his chest and laughing when he was trying to sleep. His condition worsened every day, and soon he too passed away. Like Mrs. Hendricks, he left with a look of horror on his face. After the death of the young patient, the atmosphere in the hospital began to become more and more oppressive. Jennifer felt fear literally permeate the walls of the ward. The medical staff tried to stay cheerful, but everyone understood that there was something ominous in the air. Patients increasingly complained of disturbing dreams, feeling of suffocation, and a feeling that someone was watching them. Doctors had no choice but to prescribe sedatives and ignore the growing anxiety. One evening, when Jennifer was back on night duty, she heard one of the patients start screaming loudly. This scream was full of horror and pain, as if a man was dying in agony. Jennifer rushed into the room where the sound was coming from and saw a man trying to get out of bed, tearing off bandages and ives. His face was contorted with horror. Eyes were wide open, but they seemed to be staring into space. "It's here. Going to kill me," he shouted, ignoring his wounds and the blood dripping from his hands. Jennifer barely managed to calm the patient down by calling several colleagues for help. His condition was so severe that it was necessary to immobilize him so that he would not harm himself even more. But even under the influence of sedatives, the man continued to mutter that he felt someone's presence, heard laughter, and could not breathe. Jennifer couldn't sleep that night. She was tormented by thoughts of what was happening in the hospital. She felt herself sinking more and more into the atmosphere of madness. The next day, having gathered her strength, she decided to go to the head doctor of the department. Dr. Robertson, a man with a cold and reasonable mind, listened to her story with apparent wariness. "Jennifer, I know it's hard for you," he began, clasping his hands on the table. "We are all going through a difficult time. The situation in the department is tense, but such things happen in medicine. People are afraid of death, they have psychoses, hallucinations. But it's not just fear," Jennifer interrupted. "I feel it too. Something is wrong in our department. I've seen patients die, and every one of them said the same thing. It's here. They all feel something real." Dr. Robertson sighed and looked at Jennifer sympathetically. but his eyes remained cold. "I understand that you need to rest. It might be worth taking a vacation to recuperate. I'll put you on light duty until you feel better." Jennifer couldn't agree with that. She knew that something was going on, that she just couldn't stay away. The nights in the hospital were getting scarier. The walls of the building itself seemed to be soaked with madness, and Jennifer couldn't ignore it. The next evening, she decided to stay in the hospital after her shift ended. She needed to figure out what was going on, and she knew that if she stayed, she could solve this mystery. Her feet led her to the ward where this chain of strange deaths began. She walked slowly down the corridor, listening to the sounds, peering into the shadows. Suddenly she heard a rustle, as if someone or something was moving in the dark. Jennifer tensed, feeling a rush of adrenaline. She walked slowly towards the sound, trying not to make a sound. The rustling grew louder, and she realized that the source of the sound was in one of the wards. She cautiously opened the door and froze. There was no one in the room, but the bed was rumpled, as if someone had just got up from it. The air in the room was thick and musty, as if no one had been breathing here for a long time. Jennifer took a step inside, her heart pounding like crazy. A faint flicker in the corner of the room caught her attention. She walked slowly over to him and saw a small plastic bag half hidden under the bed. Inside the package, Jennifer found an old photograph, black and white image of the doctors and patients of this hospital, taken many years ago. But something else immediately caught her eye. There was something written on the back of the photo. Her hands trembled as she read the words, "This place is killing us. We're leaving, but not all of us." She could feel fear squeezing her heart. Jennifer looked at the photo again and suddenly realized that many of the people in it were her colleagues, but they had not worked here for a long time. They all left. No one ever said why. Suddenly, she heard a soft rustle behind her. Turning around, she saw a vague silhouette in the shadows. "Who's here?" "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The silhouette didn't move, but it seemed to be watching her. She felt cold sweat trickle down her back. Jennifer took a step back, realizing she couldn't stay here any longer. She ran out of the room, feeling fear completely take over her mind. Her legs carried her to the exit of the department. She knew she had to leave this place before it was too late. But when she got to the door, she stopped when she saw her reflection in the glass. It wasn't hers. It was looking at her with a creepy, inhuman grin. Jennifer rushed outside, trying to breathe in fresh air, but her breathing became ragged, as if something was squeezing her lungs. Laughter sounded in her head again, like an echo reverberating in every corner of her mind. She realized that now this horror was haunting her, and that her mind would no longer belong to herself. She fell to her knees, gasping for breath, and the last thing she saw before her consciousness plunged into darkness was that very silhouette standing at the exit, looking at her with malicious satisfaction.